Well, Rolf Metzner, thank you for talking with Reality Sandwich today.
Okay.
We're at the MAPS 2010 Psychedelic Science Conference. There's been an amazing amount of information disseminated the last few days about where psychedelic culture is in a medicinal sense. What's your thoughts on where psychedelic culture is now, knowing that you're one of the founders of, I guess, the movement and the work you did in the 60s at Harvard? And where do you think it is now? Where do you think it could have been if things had been different?
Well, I don't know where it could have been, but I mean, Ramdas and I just finished this book, a conversational memoir called Birth of a Psychedelic Culture. So the focus there is the culture. And what is a culture? It's a web of interconnections of people pursuing knowledge, creative expression, understandings, relationships, social functions, patterns like that. So science, scientific research with psychedelic drugs is definitely one part of it, but it's not all of it. So what is encouraging about this conference is because there has been a hiatus on actual legitimate scientific research on psychedelics for about 40 years. And it's interesting that Albert Hoffman's, just in the year before he died, got to see the first resumption of a scientific study with LSD after this long hiatus since late 60s, 1966 or so, when all research with psychedelics came to a grinding halt due to the inability of the mainstream culture to really accept it.
Do you think that's the difference now, Ralph? That it's taken 50 years or so, but mainstream Western culture is now matured enough to be able to accept the psychedelic experience?
Well, something has changed. Obviously, culture changes, and but what has happened is that it's become scientifically within the scientific and medical establishment to study these things again. But psychedelic culture is more than the scientific research in the medical establishment. It's basically much of it has become an underground culture. It's interesting. In an interview that Hoffman did in 1963, which was right at the beginning of our Harvard study, in a letter that he wrote to Tim Leary, where Tim Leary was suggesting this concept of consciousness expanding, which is actually I now think is a better word for these substances than psychedelic, because psychedelic is a kind of
mind manifesting.
Well, it's become a term of abuse for one thing, and has all kinds of associations of danger. It's even a genre of pop art, psychedelic art, the kind of swirling paisleys and stuff like that. And but consciousness expanding is two words that everybody knows: consciousness and expanding. And you kind of ask yourself, "Wow, I wonder what that means." That consciousness is the kind of thing that can be expanded. I wonder how that happens. So what happens when you expand it? And can it also be contracted? For example, which is what I've been writing about recently in the different, because I think of addictions, for example, as consciousness contracting, because consciousness contracting isn't always bad. Anytime you focus or concentrate, you're contracting your awareness. You're on the thing you're focused on, and then not so much on everything else. But addictions and compulsions are fixated, repetitive, contracted consciousness. And so is fear and rage. Fear and rage are pathologically contracted states. You have the narrowed eyes and the tense muscles. You're dealing with danger either by fight or flight. You're not so much aware of the smell of the roses and the flowers and the music in the air and the beautiful woman and whatever, so like that. So this notion of consciousness expansion, and Hoffman said he liked this idea because he felt the implications and the possible applications of these substances. This was early 1963, went beyond the medical, psychiatric, and pharmacological.
Well, it seems like that's where we're back now, the starting point of being in just a medical frequency of looking at how to use these substances, when in fact you've done a lot of work with indigenous cultures and shamanism and the more tribal, spiritual way of approaching this. Like it's more than just a medical issue, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's the historical background, cross-cultural shamanic, anthropological studies of plants and substances like ayahuasca and so forth that have a role and play a role in healing and so forth. But it's our culture, our society is fragmented. So that, for example, the professions of priest and doctor and psychotherapist are three separate professional branches, each of which, has some interest in psychedelic drugs. I mean, there's religious implications, for example, that being studied again now in some of these studies. And of course, medicine, straight medicine, LSD being used in the treatment of cluster headaches, and addiction is sort of psychological, psychosomatic, like that, mind-body issues. In traditional cultures, those three realms are not separate. They're all so they have a worldview that sees the human beings much more holistically than we do. And I think that's part of the challenge of psychedelic experiences. They're multidimensional experiences, and so they force us to think beyond our categories and like that. And in terms of historically, socially, what happened as a result of the use of psychedelics becoming illegal, then, not only did the legitimate research stop, but the people that wanted to continue using it and had access to it went underground. Basically, so it's an underground culture, like a mycelium for the mushroom. It's underground. It's not visible. I mean, it's not secret in the sense that you can go there.
9/10 is underground.
But it's discreet. It doesn't
Ralph,
announce itself in public. It doesn't do press conferences. It doesn't get government grants, for example.
Ralph, 2010 is the 50th anniversary, I think, of when you was beginning the Harvard test in 1960 with psilocybin.
61,
61?
Yeah.
So it's coming up to the 50 years.
Yeah,
I mean, what were your thoughts back then when that brave new horizon was opening up that we're seeing come around again now?
Well,
what were your hopes for that time?
We didn't know shit, basically. We knew nothing. We were like babes in the woods. We were like, Harvard was two paradigms, psychoanalysis and behaviorism. That was it. They didn't even read Jung, and certainly knew nothing about Eastern religion or shamanism. Nothing. When we first started, we were like professors and graduate students. I was a graduate student, and others graduate students. In a psychology department.
So you think it was inevitable when the backlash happened and Tim and Richard Alpert got kicked out? I mean, how did you feel? You were left there. The two big names had been.
We didn't. We all left. We all left the university. First of all, the university clamped down on doing any more studies under the auspices of the university. We did initially 2 years of studies, with psilocybin under university auspices, a prison rehabilitation project, a study on religious experience with Walter Pankey. And then they no longer wanted to sponsor the research, and under university because they were scared by the publicity and but that was not our doing. It wasn't like we were handing out drugs freely to people. We weren't doing that. I mean, people thought we agreed we made agreements with the university. Now Alpert violated the agreement of giving a drug to an undergraduate, and that came out, and the university wanted to get rid of it. It was not because a student complained, not because anybody was harmed or parents complained or anything like that. They wanted to get rid of us. They felt uncomfortable about the language that Leary was using, not so much about what he was doing, but about the language that he was using that he felt was like over enthusiastic, and he felt, well, this is just the way he felt. He didn't want to keep it secret.
Do you think that we're ready now as a culture? We discussed earlier, if Harvard and the other institutions which represent the culture in microcosm, do you think they'd be ready now to have another go at the psychedelic experience?
Well, they are. They're having a go at doing research on the possible medical and therapeutic and healing applications, and that's tremendously important. And to some extent, religious, study of religious experience.
There was a follow-up with the Walter Pankey experiment, the Good Friday experiments recently too.
That's right. But, that's only one aspect or one layer of culture, scientific medical research, and it doesn't really even begin. Now, for example, take something like, but the explorations of the possible healing potentials are so great. So then studies now, MAPS is sponsoring studies on the use of MDMA, with PTSD. And PTSD is an unbelievable, horrendous problem. I was just talking to Rick Doblin. There's 250,000 people suffering from PTSD from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens more every month. And there's no way of treating them. It costs, Rick, I just talked to Rick about this, it costs something like $5 billion the Pentagon, the Defense Department, to take care of these people, disability people, for the rest of their life. There's no way to treatment. You're on drugs, disability for the rest of your life. Now, MDMA is the most promising treatment for PTSD that's ever been discovered, bar none.
I think
and the evidence is very, very strong. But how many subjects have there been run? 3, 4, half a dozen.
I mean, psychedelic medicine obviously has a very effective usage that could help people, but do you think it could actually be used almost as a soma for the masses or as something to keep them in the paradigm?
I doubt it very much. I doubt very much that would ever happen.
They treat the post-traumatic stress disorder, but they don't cause the root cause of war or the culture which goes to war.
No, yeah, right. Well, but, even if you just found some way to heal people, these terribly wounded people, that in itself would be a peacemaking gesture. I don't think it's ever going to be something that be available, and Leary didn't think so either. I mean, he testified at one point in Congress saying the drugs need to be regulated. Of course, the whole debate about legalization or criminalization is pointless. It's not a dualistic either or. You have to do one or the other. They have to be regulated. And I, for example, think that alcohol should be regulated more. They should be involved. It really used to say you should, just like you have to get a pilot's license or an automobile license to be able to get into a car or a plane, you have to be educated, you have to be trained and guided, and before you'll give you a license to buy your own plane and go fly around. And should be the same thing. And I think the same thing should apply to alcohol. I think there should be more regulation because alcohol is far too dangerous to just hand out to people. We should have just like you do for a driver's license, you have to have an educational program. What are the effects of alcohol on the brain? What are the chances of developing alcoholism? What are the statistics on alcoholism and how you treat it? It's a major public health disaster. So
what do you think in general then is the
I don't think
future of psychedelics?
And I think the same applies to cannabis. I think cannabis is the one modality that has a chance of becoming regulated as even beyond the medical framework. In California, it's an initiative process there. But obviously it has to be regulated, and obviously there are laws already on the books. You don't need to pass more laws. There are laws already on the books. You don't drive. You don't give it to teenagers and underage people, and you don't protect people from harm. That's the whole thing. The whole drug thing needs to be moved out of law enforcement. The use of drugs needs to be out of law enforcement into public health. And of course, yes, people have addictions and all that kind of thing, and they need to be treated, not jailed. You get these 2.5 million people who are in victimless crimes. What's that to do with the economy? And I think the economic argument is very strong. California's got a $22 billion deficit, and if they regulated and taxed the cannabis production, that'd be $5 billion. That's the size of a chunk of the deficit. And I think there's a good chance that something like that could happen. In 1935, the alcohol prohibition was repealed, right, in the midst of the Depression. People finally woke up, why should we let the gangsters and Al Capone get all the money from this? And we could tax it and we could, fill our coffers.
Do you feel optimistic about the near-term future of psychedelics?
I really don't know anymore what's optimistic or pessimistic. It's too. I mean, there's some good things and there's some positive things. I think in the area of treatments, the two most positive applications that are being discussed here and that are, have been widely demonstrated and in Europe as well, is the use of psychedelics in the treatment of addictions, because their consciousness expanding as a treatment to consciousness contraction, and the use of psychedelics as a aid to helping people prepare for dying. And there are some studies like that, reduce anxiety around terminal with psilocybin, with MDMA. And there's so much misunderstanding. That's all part of the worldview. And misunderstanding and misconceptions about death and fear, and you can't very easily change people's worldview, but you can certainly make things easier for them. And the studies are very, very clear. People take, with no prior experience, have got a terminal diagnosis, they take psilocybin or MDMA, and they have a really good chance of, going into that final transition with a peaceful attitude, which is a blessing, absolutely, that could come out of this.